Let me just, if I could, begin with a question for you. This is a rhetorical question. I don't expect you to answer this out loud, but why are you here? Not like why are you here in church, although that would probably be a good question to consider and ponder, but we'll say that for another day. But, I mean, why are you here? Why are you on this planet? Why are you alive? Why are you living the life that you're living? What is your purpose? What gets you up in the morning? When life is really difficult, what is it that kind of keeps you going? Why are you here? You know, a lot of people have asked that question through the millennia. And it just astounds me how much good has been done in our world as a result of people asking that question and finding answers to it. Just think of the amazing stories that have been led over the history of the world and the good that has been done by people who have asked and answered this question. You know, Noah asked the question, and he said, well, I'm here to build an ark. And so he built an ark, and that was pretty cool, right? And then Moses says, I am living to free a nation and to move them into a land of their own. King David was a guy who lived to give glory to God. Jesus was born and lived to save us from our sin and to provide eternal life. The Apostle Paul lived to take the gospel to the entire Gentile world. And Peter, while he lived, he was content just to take it to the Jewish world. More recently, men like Abraham Lincoln asked the question, he answered by saying, I am living to free the slaves. And he gave his life doing it. Billy Graham is a guy who said, I'm going to live to take the gospel to the entire known world. And he came pretty close to doing it. Martin Luther King said, I have a dream. And he said, the reason I am alive is to bring equality to all people, regardless of the color of their skin. And Mother Teresa, well, she lived to serve the poorest of the poor in Calcutta's slums. I mean, just think of the amazing stories that have been lived down through the centuries by people who ask the question, why am I here? And they find the answer to that question. They find their noble ambition, and they live into it. And they live great stories as a result. You know, if you were with us last week, we started talking about what makes a great story, what it takes to live a great story. And if you remember, there are 4 parts to every great story. Let's see how well you were listening last week. What was the first part of what makes a really great story? You guys are good, excellent. So first of all, we have to have a protagonist. We have to have a main character that is likable, that we will root for, that we feel invested in, that we want to win. They have to be someone that we can support. Number 2, the protagonist has to have that noble ambition. They have to want to accomplish something greater than themselves, bigger than themselves. They have to want to change themselves or help somebody else or save somebody or improve the world somehow. And the third part of a great story is what? Conflict, that's right. The protagonist has to encounter hardship or conflict in the accomplishment of that noble ambition. That dream of theirs can't come easily, but it must come through hardship and difficulty. They have to dig deep. They have to sacrifice for it. Otherwise, it's not a very good story. And finally, there needs to be some sort of resolution. Right? We need to bring that out. Every great story has these 4 parts. Every book you read, every movie you watch, every story you tell, look for those parts. If it's got them, you're probably going to have a good story. If you don't, not such a great story. Now, I was introduced to these 4 movements of story when I read Donald Miller's book, A Million Miles in 1,000 Years, What I Learned While Editing My Own Life. Now, Don tells a really funny story about how he wrote this book called Blue Like Jazz, and it had all these vignettes from his life. And a movie producer came to him and said, I want to make a movie of your life. And of course, this would be an exciting venture for Don. He's like, sure, let's make a movie of my life. And so he sat down with the screenwriter, the guy who's going to write the script, and they start writing. And the guy starts asking questions of Don, like, okay, so how are we going to make Don likable to the people watching the movie? And of course, Don is wondering, well, why do we have to change Don at all? I mean, what's not likable about me now? Right? Why do we have to ask this question? And then the screenwriter would go into questions like, well, what is Don's noble ambition? What's his big ambition? What does he want to accomplish in life? And Don, again, is thinking, why do we have to change my life in order to make it interesting? But that got him thinking about his life, and it got him thinking about his story, and he began to ask himself questions like, am I living a good life? Do I have a noble ambition? And as he looked at his own life, and as he considered the people around him, people that he knew, people that he observed, he started to see how few people really have a noble ambition in their lives. You know, if we were to tell the story of many people living in our culture today and look for their noble ambition, what would it be? What are the things that people are living for, towards success, accomplishment? He uses the metaphor of our culture that our big noble ambition is to maybe buy a brand new Volvo. Maybe that's our big noble ambition. My ambition is to work hard and to save money so that I could buy a new Volvo. But really, what kind of story would that be to watch or read or listen to? Just picture with me. The scene opens with a young teenager, and their big noble ambition is to own a brand new S70. And so they go to college, and they study hard, and they're up late at night trying to get good grades, and they finally graduate, and then they get a really good job, and they save, and they scrimp, and they put their money away until finally, as the movie comes to a climax, they realize that look at their savings account. They have enough for the S70, and the movie comes to a close as our protagonist is driving off of the Volvo parking lot, the dealership parking lot, and the credits roll. Is that the kind of movie you would want to see? Is that the kind of book you would want to read? Is that the kind of story that inspires you? Truth be told, finding a person in our culture with a noble ambition is a rare thing indeed. Just look with me for a moment into the heart of our culture. Take a look at what are the things that we value as a culture? What are the things that captivate our attention? What are the things that we spend our time thinking about? There's two words I can give you to answer that question. Google searches. What are the things that we're Googling the most? In 2015, the list is now out, the top 5 Google searches, the people that captivated our attention, the subjects that captivated our attention, more than anything else in our culture. What are the things that we're thinking about? Top 5 things. Number 1, Lamar Odom. Lamar Odom is a basketball player who got caught in a sex scandal, almost died of a drug overdose in 2015. Jurassic World, a movie about dinosaurs. American Sniper, a movie about an American soldier. Caitlyn Jenner, formerly Bruce Jenner, and Ronda Rousey, a ring fighter, a woman fighter in the ring thing. And so these are the things that captivated our attention. Or consider what were the top 5 how-to Google searches. What are the things that we went to more than anything else to the internet to learn how to do? What do we want to be good at? What's important to us that we do right? Top 5 how-to Google searches of 2015. How do I use the new Snapchat update? Number 1. Number 2, how do I solve a Rubik's Cube? Number 3, how do I get legendary marks? Don't even know what that means. I'm waiting for some teenage laughter, thinking maybe there's something there. I don't know. How do I play Charlie? Charlie is number 4. Don't know what that is. And then finally, very important, how do I get the new emojis? Welcome to our world. If Google is any indication of what captivates our attention, the end is near. It may be a rare thing, but when we find a person with a noble ambition, or when we hear a story of a person who is pursuing something, living all out for something bigger than themselves, or when we ourselves find why we are here and we live toward that noble ambition, there is nothing more inspiring. There is no greater story. And in Nehemiah, we find such an ambition and we find such a story. We left off last week. We had met Nehemiah. Nehemiah was a Jewish man who lived in about the 4th century BC. Although he was Jewish, he didn't live in Jerusalem. He lived in Persia because about 100 years before Nehemiah was born, Jerusalem was destroyed. Any survivors among the Jews were carried off into exile into Babylon, and the Persians took over. And now Nehemiah is growing up in Persia. He's never seen Jerusalem before, never been to Judah. But he is a man of power and influence within the Persian Empire because we learn he is the cupbearer to the king. This means he is the guy who tasted the food and the wine for the king before the king would consume it. And so what we learn is that the story begins with Nehemiah receiving really bad news from some folks who had just come from Jerusalem, that the walls and the gates of Jerusalem are still in rubble. that despite the fact that Jews had begun returning to Jerusalem some 80 years before, the temple had been rebuilt, still there was no wall surrounding Jerusalem to protect the city and to protect the temple. And so Nehemiah is devastated by this bad news. He can't believe that the walls still haven't been rebuilt. And so he responds to this bad news by praying. He prays this beautiful prayer, and he praises God for being a good God. He doesn't blame God for any of it. As a matter of fact, he confesses his own sins and the sins of his fathers. And then he prays this prayer of faith, saying, God, I know you're going to do something about this. And when we left off last week, we left off at the end of this prayer with Nehemiah praying that he could be a part of the solution. And in chapter 1, verse 11, this is what Nehemiah prays. He says, O Lord, let your ear be attentive to the prayer of this your servant. Give your servant success today by granting him favor in the presence of this man, the king. So Nehemiah says, I want to be a part of the solution, but I know that you're going to have to move on the heart of the king. I'm going to need the king's help. And so God, you're going to have to move, because to get the king's help on this, it's going to be a miracle. You may say, well, why would it be a miracle for the king to give his help? Well, think about what Nehemiah would need from the king in order to live out his noble ambition. First of all, he's going to need the king to release him from his job for a long period of time. Nehemiah doesn't have the kind of job that you or I do. He can't quit his job. He can't put in for a leave of absence. He can't put in for a transfer. He is a personal servant to the most powerful man on the planet. And what the most powerful man on the planet wants, he gets. And he likes Nehemiah. He's built rapport with Nehemiah. He trusts Nehemiah. He doesn't want to have to train a new cupbearer. So to let Nehemiah go for this extended period of time would take a miracle. And so Nehemiah prays. Nehemiah also prays it's going to be a miracle because he is going to need the blessing of the king on this project to rebuild the walls of Jerusalem. Now, Jerusalem, you have to know, has a history of being a rebellious people. The king would know about this. Just search the archives. He knows that they are always rebelling against the powers over them, like the Persians. So why would the Persian king give this rebellious people permission to build a wall protecting them from him? It would take a miracle for him to say, yes, go ahead, build the walls. And so Nehemiah prays. And finally, Nehemiah prays, it's going to be a miracle because Nehemiah needs the king to fund the entire project. They have no resources. And so they're going to need him to kind of break out his checkbook and fund the whole thing. And this is going to be a miracle right there. And so Nehemiah prays. And Nehemiah prays. And what happens? Nothing. For 4 months, nothing happens. The story starts in chapter 1 in the month of like December we saw last week. And our story is going to pick up this week in the month of Nisan, which is the equivalent of April. So 4 months go by with nothing happening. I just wonder what is going on in Nehemiah's heart as he's waiting these 4 months for God to answer his prayer. And if you've ever prayed for anything important in your life, things that you believe are urgent, things that you believe are noble, things that you believe that God would certainly care about, and you've prayed and you've brought them to him, and it seems like you get no response, you can kind of get a sense of what Nehemiah must have been feeling during that time. I mean, God, this is a noble ambition. God, you said that the walls of Jerusalem will be rebuilt. I am praying to you. I'm right here. I'm waiting. Do something. And for 4 months he prays, and for 4 months nothing happens, and for 4 months he waits. And if you have waited, or if you're in a period of waiting right now, maybe you've been praying and praying, and it looks like God is silent, and if you're there right now, just take courage from what happens for Nehemiah after 4 months of his waiting as we pick up our story in chapter 2. Verse 1. In the month of Nisan, in the 20th year of King Artaxerxes, and again from history we know this is the month of April, about 445 BC, when wine was brought for him, I took the wine and gave it to the king. I had not been sad in his presence before. So the king asked me, why does your face look so sad when you are not ill? This could be nothing but sadness of heart. I was very much afraid. So Nehemiah is in the king's presence and he's sad. And we wonder, well, why is he sad now? Why wasn't he sad the first day he got the bad news? Why is it like 4 months afterwards he's sad all of a sudden? I don't know why, but I'm thinking maybe Nehemiah is starting to get frustrated with God. He's been waiting. He's been praying. Maybe he just had an argument with God that morning. Like, God, when are you going to do something about this? I'm going to go give wine to the king. And he goes in, but for whatever reason, he's serving wine to the king. And the king notices that he's sad. And he asks the question that Nehemiah has been asking, waiting for him to ask. He's like, hey, you look like something's really troubling you. What's going on? This is the perfect opportunity for Nehemiah to share his burden. But I find it really, really interesting that the first thing Nehemiah says as he tells his own story is, I was very much afraid. I love this about Nehemiah. What a glimpse into his heart. Nehemiah is a guy like me. He has fear. He's afraid. And as he writes his story, he's not afraid to talk about it. You know, as we're going to see throughout the story, Nehemiah isn't a guy who gets scared very easily. I mean, he's going to face down some amazing challenges as we continue in his story. Death threats, betrayal, criticism, mocking. And he does it all with this courage and bravery. But here in the presence of the king, he is very much afraid. What is he afraid of? Well, I think the first thing he's afraid of is he's in the presence of the king. And this isn't any king. This is the king of the Persian Empire, the most powerful man on the planet. And Nehemiah knows this man. He's seen the things he's done to other people who upset him or say the wrong thing or ask for the wrong thing. And it's not good. And so Nehemiah realizes that right now he's got to tread very lightly because he's talking to the most powerful man on the planet and he could have his life immediately. But I'm also wondering if Nehemiah thought about the cost that his noble ambition would have, not just to his physical life, but to his lifestyle. And like us, Nehemiah surely had to consider that if he followed this plan, if he pursued this dream that God had put on his heart, it would turn his life upside down. Chances are Nehemiah liked his life. He liked how comfortable his life was. He worked in the palace. He served wine to the king. He tasted the wine before the king tasted. I mean, talk about a cush job. I mean, more than that, Nehemiah is respected and looked up to in his community and in the Persian Empire. It would be a lot easier for Nehemiah just to keep his mouth shut, continue to do what he's doing, enjoy his comfortable lifestyle, than to get on a camel, go 800 miles across the desert, try to mobilize a group of people who are notoriously rebellious that he didn't even know to turn piles of rubble into a 3-mile long wall. Same is true for us. When God puts a noble ambition on our hearts, there could be fear involved. Fear of what it's going to cost us personally. We like our comfortable job, and the idea of having all of our lives turned upside down can kind of just keep us living in the status quo. You know what? I think I'm just going to stay right here. A few years ago, you may remember that we had a series called Ordinary People, Extraordinary Lives, in which we brought in these ordinary people who had done these extraordinary things in their lives. And what we saw in each one of those stories is that every one of those people had to pay a tremendous cost to do those extraordinary things. We had the first woman who walked around the world here. Right? And so she came in and she told us how it took 5 years of her life, but she did it because she wanted to raise global awareness for breast cancer. She had to quit her job. She had to sell her house. She had to give up 5 years of her life. She had to walk around the world. And that was difficult, but she did it. We had a couple in here who had given up their lucrative careers to start a restaurant, an organic restaurant in Denver catering to the homeless. They not only gave up their careers, they had to spend their entire 401k to risk it all. Or we met a young man who gave up his dream to go to college and right out of high school moved to Uganda in order to serve refugees. I mean, following our noble ambition can be scary and it can cost us something, but if it doesn't cost us something and if it's not scary, how noble is it really? I mean, everybody would be doing it. And so if you have an ambition in your life, a dream in your life that doesn't at times overwhelm you, if you have an ambition in your life that at times doesn't make you fall flat on your face before God in total dependence, if you don't have a dream that at times doesn't make you very much afraid, maybe you need to have a conversation with God about how noble that ambition really is. Nehemiah says, I was very much afraid, but I said to the king, may the king live forever. Why should my face not look sad when the city where my fathers are buried lies in ruins and its gates have been destroyed by fire? The king said to me, what is it you want? Then I prayed to the God of heaven. So Nehemiah gets the response he's been waiting for from the king. The king asks him that question, serves him up that softball. What do you want? And what does Nehemiah do? He prays more. Nehemiah is a man of faith. Nehemiah is a man, he realizes God is present in this situation. He is here in this throne room. He is in this conversation. It's God who is opening the heart of the king, causing him to ask these questions. And so Nehemiah just makes himself aware of God's presence, and he prays. And we don't know what he prayed, but we know it was a quick prayer. It was probably a silent prayer. Probably went something like this. Help! You know? You ever prayed one of those prayers? Nobody knows you're praying it, but it's like, help! Right now! Need help! God, I know you're here. Help! Whatever Nehemiah prays, because he's totally dependent on God for everything he sets his heart to do. Then I prayed to the God of heaven, and I answered the king. If it pleases the king, and if your servant has found favor in his sight, let him send me to the city of Judah, where my fathers are buried, so that I could rebuild it. Then the king, with the queen sitting beside him. I think that's interesting. He mentions the queen sitting there. Maybe the queen leaned over to the king and whispered something in his ear. Maybe she asked a question like women often do to soften the heart of their husband. We don't know, but Nehemiah remembers, the queen was there, and he mentions it in his story. The queen was sitting beside him and asked me, how long will your journey take, and when will you get back? And that's like, yes. That's like one of those buy questions. You know this is going well. He asked the right question. He's going to let me go. And indeed, he did let him go. It pleased the king to send me, so I set a time. Just imagine what Nehemiah must have been feeling in that moment. Before the most powerful man, he had made this big ask, and the man said, go. So now Nehemiah leaves the throne room, and he counts his blessings, and he jumps in the air, and he gets on a camel, and he heads for Jerusalem, right? No. He's not done. There's more. He's got more to ask for. Just look at how bold Nehemiah gets, knowing that God is now leading the circumstance, the situation, the conversation. He says, I also said to him, if it pleases the king, may I have letters to the governors of Trans-Euphrates so that they will provide me safe conduct until I arrive in Judah. And may I have a letter to Asaph, keeper of the king's forest, so he will give me timber to make beams for the gates of the citadel by the temple and for the city wall and for the residence I will occupy. Do you see what Nehemiah is asking for here? I mean, this is incredibly bold. He asks for letters, not only for permission to rebuild the walls, but also letters for a military escort to go with him the 800 miles across the desert from Persia to Judah. He wants help getting there. More than that, he asks for the king's Home Depot charge card so that he can get all the materials that he needs to rebuild the wall and to rebuild the citadel and to build himself his own house when he's in Jerusalem. So he's saying, not only do I want you to grant me permission to do this, not only am I asking for a 12-year paid vacation, I'm asking you, O king, may you live forever, to foot the bill, to pay for it all. And Nehemiah gets everything he asked for. Why? Why does Nehemiah get everything he asked for? Because he tells us, and because the gracious hand of my God was upon me, the king granted my requests. I mean, in that moment of ecstasy and recounting the story and writing it down, Nehemiah could have said, and because of my masterful negotiation skills, or because the king loved me so much, or because whatever. But he says, no, because I recognize, because the gracious hand of God was on me, I received all that I asked for. Again, we just catch this glimpse into his heart. He is a man of faith. He knows it's God who's put this ambition on his heart. He knows it's God who orchestrated events to lead the king to bring it up. He knows it's God who has provided everything that he is receiving, all his needs. I mean, clearly this is a God story more than it is a story about Nehemiah. I mean, I'm wondering, can you see the hand of God in your story as you look back on where you've been, what you've been through, how far you've come? Can you look back and see the way God has provided for you? Can you look back and see how he's opened doors for you? Have you been able to acknowledge his goodness? Do you see God's gracious hand present in your life the way Nehemiah did? Nehemiah, we get to verse 9, and it's kind of a transition verse in the story. It's where he leaves for his trip for Jerusalem. It's not only a change in geography from Persia to Jerusalem, but it's also a change in Nehemiah's role. As we get to verse 9, Nehemiah goes from being the cupbearer to the king to general contractor and wall builder and chief vision caster. And so he heads back to Jerusalem, and finally, after months of traveling, he arrives in Jerusalem. I just imagine it would create this huge buzz for the people living there. I mean, here comes the cupbearer to the king with full military escort. He's come all the way from Susa in Persia. Why is he here? Is this good news for us? Is this bad news for us? And despite all the buzz and all the questions there must have been, Nehemiah, for the first 3 days, he kind of lays low, doesn't tell anybody why he's there, doesn't answer any of their questions. But he writes that on the third day, at night, under the cover of darkness, he and a few men go out and they survey the walls. They want to see what they're dealing with. And Nehemiah gives intricate detail about where he goes and what he passed by and what he saw. But the point of the matter is that he sees that things are worse than he could have imagined. I mean, the rubble is piled so high, the debris is so thick in places, he can't even get his horse through. And so, but it says that Nehemiah, as he's looking, that God reveals this plan to Nehemiah. He all of a sudden knows what he must do. And so the next day, he calls the leaders of the city together to motivate them to action. And this is what he says. And I'm sure this is a condensed version of his speech. But then I said to them, you see the trouble we're in? Jerusalem lies in ruins, and its gates have been burned with fire. Come, let us rebuild the wall of Jerusalem, and we will no longer be in disgrace. It's that moment for a leader where he's cast the vision. He's waiting. How will they respond? And the crickets are chirping, and he's waiting. Will they say yes? Will they say no? Maybe they need a little more persuasion. So he goes on. I also told them about the gracious hand of my God upon me and what the king had said to me. In other words, God is in this. Just look at everything that's happened. All the miracles that have occurred. All the doors that have been opened. Surely God is in this. And they replied, let us start rebuilding. So they began this good work. Wow. Nehemiah cast the vision for what could be, pointed to the fact that God was involved, told his fellow countrymen of his noble ambition, and they respond in excited agreement. Let's do this. And so the rebuilding begins. And I can only imagine what a relief it was for Nehemiah to see that they had kind of bought into his vision, right? Or no, but it wasn't really his vision at all, was it? I mean, from the very beginning, this was God's vision. And Nehemiah knew this. Nehemiah knew this isn't my dream. Rather, it's God's dream. Just look at how this is a theme running all throughout his story. Right here in this verse, he talks about the gracious hand of my God being upon me. Nehemiah is able to say, all the success we've had so far, it's not about me. It's all about him. He has provided for all of it. Or again, in verse 20, as he's getting criticized by some folks, he answers that criticism by saying, the God of heaven will give us success. In other words, this isn't my battle, it's not our battle, this is God's battle. And if the walls of Jerusalem are going to be rebuilt, and if the city of Jerusalem is going to be restored, it's not going to be because of what we do, it's going to be because of what God does. It's his battle. God will give us success. Or consider what he says in verse 12, where he writes, I had not told anyone what my God had put on my heart to do for Jerusalem. I just love this. Nehemiah acknowledges this isn't even his dream. He didn't come up with this. He acknowledges where this noble ambition came from, and it was God's dream. He didn't think it up. He says, God put this on my heart. What we're starting to see here in chapter 2 is that this isn't primarily a story about Nehemiah, but really, it's a story about God. It's a story of what God does through Nehemiah to accomplish his will. God wanted the walls of Jerusalem to be rebuilt. As a matter of fact, hundreds of years before, he prophesied that it would happen. He knew what he was going to do. And so he looks around and he looks for someone who has some faith, who has some courage, a bit of boldness. And he says, are you willing to join me in my greater story? Do you want to live for you, or do you want to live for something that is timeless? Do you want to join me in what I am doing in the world? And this is really the point. Great stories are lived when we realize we are not the protagonist or the main character in our own story. Great stories are lived when I realize that Dave Kennedy is not starring in his movie with everyone else as a supporting role. Great stories are lived when we realize that God is the protagonist in his greater, grander story, and he's calling us into his story to play supporting roles in what he is doing. when we get this, when we truly get this, it changes everything. Why was Nehemiah able to do what he was able to do? Why was he able to be so bold, risking his life before the king? Why was he willing to leave his life of luxury in Susa? Why was he willing to do all the hard work and face all the persecution and the mocking and the criticism and the death threats in Jerusalem? Why was he able to do all that? Because he realized it wasn't about him. It wasn't his story. He's not the star. Nehemiah realizes, I am a part of a bigger story that's going to go on with or without me, but I get this one life, this one chance, this one window to be alive, and I want my life to count for something, and so I'm going to join God in his bigger, better, grander story. And Nehemiah got that small part to play in his great story, and we're talking about him 2,400 years later. If he had lived for his own glory or for his own story, chances are we wouldn't be talking about him today. But the reason, I believe, the reason so many people in our culture live empty lives chasing after Volvos is because we have this misconception that somehow we are the star of our own story. And we put ourselves in the center of everything. We are the protagonist, and everyone else has a supporting role in my story. And that leads us to live selfishly rather than selflessly. It's about me rather than about others. It's about safety first rather than taking risks. It's about caution rather than boldness because we feel like we have so much to protect. We're the main person, so we have so much to lose because it's about us. But when we realize, you know what, this isn't my story. I'm not the main character. We're simply playing a part in God's bigger story. It frees us up to ask ourselves, what is your part for me in your story? What is your grand ambition for my life? What is your dream for me? How can I join you in what you're already doing? And when God calls us into his story, if we're doing what his will is, then we could do it boldly, we could do it courageously, we could do it fearlessly, because we realize if God is in it, we will succeed. Whether that means giving our lives, living, dying, whatever it means we get this one chance to live in his greater story and to make an impact on something that's going to echo out into eternity. So how might your story change if you just made this one shift in thinking about who the protagonist in your story is? What might happen if you just start to say, you know what, it's not about me. It's about him. My story is just one frame in the long reel of this story that God has been telling for millennia, this epic story of redemption. But I get my one frame, my short life to live for something so much bigger than me. How might that change the way you live? I mean, what if you were to ask God, just really get honest with God and say, what part do you have me to play? Why am I here? Why did you create me? What plans do you have for me? If you were to discover that one noble ambition, and if you were to follow it, do you think that would be a great story? It doesn't have to be building a 3-mile wall long. It doesn't have to be evangelizing the world. It doesn't have to be freeing a nation. God could be calling you to do something like creating community for those who most need it, broken people, or feeding hungry people. It could be starting a nonprofit, or maybe starting a business that's going to meet a specific need, or it could be working for a business that is meeting a specific need in our community or in our world. Or maybe your noble ambition, that thing that God wants for you to do is simply to live a long obedience in the same direction. That is a noble life lived, a life lived following Christ. To continually just do things that honor him and give life to others. Why are you here? I believe you're here to play a part in God's great story of redemption, a story that's been going on for millennia and soon is going to wrap up with the restoration of all things. And so let me just give you 3 takeaways as we close here. If you are here today and you have never acknowledged that God is the great protagonist of this great story, if you've never submitted your story and brought it under the authority and the power of his story, then why not do that? To live for our own glory is too small a thing. But to live to bring glory to God and to take part in what he's doing that's going to last for eternity, that's a story well lived. And so all that means is to be able to say, you know what, God? You're God, and I'm not. It's all about you, not about me. Spend the rest of my life from this day forward however you see fit. And once we do that, then we may say, well, then what do I do? Well, what's my purpose? How do I find that out? Well, let me just ask you, how will you order your life this year to put yourself in a place where you could hear from God so he could tell you or show you what he's doing around you so you could join him in it? Let me just give you 4 suggestions of things that people have been doing for thousands of years, like Nehemiah did, that put you in a place where you could hear from God. Number 1, spend time with God. Nehemiah was a man of prayer. It's one of the ways he spent time with God. He knew the scriptures. Spend time with God. Number 2, commit yourself to corporate worship. This is one of the places where we get to hear from God. God speaks to our heart. Number 3, surround yourself with a group of people who are walking in the same direction, who will be able to encourage you. Join a small group is what we would say in today's language. And number 4, get in service somewhere so that you can see what God is doing. Serve in your world. Do those 4 things. And if you don't have a plan to do that yet, as you leave here today, we've been talking about it for a couple weeks, our personal growth plan. It's just a very simple tool that gives you the ability to put together a plan of how you're going to incorporate those 4 ingredients in your life in 2016. Let me just say one more thing, one more takeaway. Our grow groups start meeting again this week. And it's no coincidence that Nehemiah kind of got his noble ambition as he was surrounded with a group of God followers talking about what God was doing, that was awakened within him. And so I would just say, you have an opportunity to get with other people heading in the same direction to talk about things that are important. So if you're in a grow group already, commit yourself to that group this cycle, for the rest of the cycle, and just listen, what is God doing? What is God calling me to? And if you're not in a group, as you leave here today, again, there'll be little sheets of paper letting you know where our groups are and when they meet, so that I'm sure we'd have lots of leaders happy to have you join them as groups start meeting again this week. Who knows what you might discover about how your story fits in with God's greater story as you put yourself in a place where you could hear from him.